for today's movie review, we're back in Fate territory with Fate Grand Order First Order, the second Fate movie that I've covered on this channel. The first one being Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works, the movie, which I covered back in 2015. And if you want to know my full thoughts on that movie, I'll leave a link in the description down below. However, if you don't feel like checking out that review and just want to know what my initial thoughts on that movie are, long story short, I don't like that movie. Granted, around that time period, my only other exposure to the Fate franchise was in the form of Fate Zero. Since then, I've checked out quite a few of the anime adaptations of certain Fate properties. Not all of them, certain ones, and it goes something like this. Fate Zero I still think is a great anime. As for the original Fate Stay Night anime from 2006, I think the show is flawed but enjoyable. Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works, the TV show, I think is great. Much better than the movie counterpart. Fate Apocrypha I have mixed feelings on, because I love the ideas introduced and I love the first half of that series, but I feel the show kind of falls apart narratively in the second half. Fate Extra Last Encore I did not like at all, and as of now is my least favorite of the Fate anime adaptations. As for some of the other Fate movies or TV shows, I have yet to see them, which leads us right into our review of Fate Grand Order First Order, which from what I could gather is a TV-made movie that mainly adapts the opening prologue of Fate Grand Order itself. As far as this movie is concerned, can you watch this movie by itself without playing or watching any of the other installments of the Fate franchise? As for the plot of the movie, in the far distant future of 2015, a organization called Caldea that specializes in using both magic and science monitors the world around them to prevent the extinction of mankind. However, their peace is soon interrupted when an explosion goes off within their organization. To make matters even worse, the remaining surviving crew members discover that a singularity has appeared in the far distant past, and now it's up to a new cadet, his demi-servant, along with their director, to travel back into the past to said singularity in order to save the future. So in terms of what I liked about the movie, for something that was essentially a TV-made movie, the animation is a lot better than I was expected it to be. It actually looks pretty good. Sure, it does do that thing where Ufotable, for some reason, anytime they design a character that has bangs hanging in front of the character's eyes, the hair itself is like see-through, but the rest of their hair is like a solid color. But other than that, I thought the animation was pretty good. Another aspect of the movie that I appreciate is how this movie plays with the lore of the Fate Stay Night mythos, in that sense where in Fate Stay Night, Cahulin, who's typically the Lancer in that series, shows up here, but instead of being a Lancer, he's a caster, which I thought was pretty neat, seeing a character that we've seen before, but in a different class, along with Medusa, who in Fate Stay Night was typically the writer, but in this movie was the Lancer. So it did seem like the people behind this movie had fun tweaking the pre-established lore of Fate Stay Night and kind of went into a different direction with it for this movie, which I find to be refreshing. And I think the designs that are given to both Cahulin and Medusa when they're in these classes, I think are pretty well designed. And I do appreciate that they give them a completely different look than what they looked like in their previous class, which is something you usually don't see often in the Fate series. But I feel like if you're a newcomer who hasn't seen any of the other Fate properties, this might not matter much to you, but for someone who has seen it, I think that was a pretty neat spin on a pre-established mythology. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the introduction of a new class of servant, because in the Fate franchise, the general premise is that every decade the Holy Grail shows up, in which 7 humans that possess some sort of magic become a master to a servant. The servant in question could be a person of historical or mythological significance that are summoned in one of 7 classes. Say we're basically people who use swords, lancers, people who use lances, casters, servants who predominantly focus on magic, archers, people who use projectile weapons, riders who ride into battle. Then you have both the assassin and berserker classes, which are the wild cards. One subtle, one not so subtle. So you could literally have a battle between one master who could have Beowulf summoned in the saber class, while the other master could have Harry Houdini summoned in the assassin class. With this movie, we get the introduction introduction to a new class of servant called the demi-servant, which is when someone, instead of becoming a master to a servant, this person makes a contract with a servant and gains the powers of that servant, while still serving a human master. Sure, I think there's some details that could be expanded upon, but I thought the introduction of this class of servant was a cool way to spice up the Fate series in some shape or form. And although we never figure out which servant merged with the human character of Mash, who becomes the demi-servant, I do appreciate that they sprinkle hints throughout the movie, but not enough to necessarily confirm the identity of said servant, leaving it open for a mystery to be unraveled within this story. Another aspect of the movie that I really enjoyed are the fight scenes when we have our main cast of characters entering the singularity and question, from the moment they arrive to seeing Caster fighting Lancer, and the climax in which we see our main group of characters fighting both Saber and Archer. I think each fight scene was well choreographed and fun to watch, with my favorite being the fight between Caster and Lancer, for the simple reason that, as I mentioned earlier, this is a fight in which we see the mythology of this Holy Grail War being played with, since we see Cahulan and Medusa in two different servant classes than they were in any adaptation of Fate Stay Night. Now, in terms of an aspect of the movie that I have mixed feelings on, is the whole time traveling aspect, because on the one hand, this is something that's new to the entire franchise, since we've never seen time travel done in the Fate franchise, no matter if it's Fate Stay Night, Fate Zero, or even Fate Apocrypha. And I think time travel is always a fun concept to introduce in a movie or TV show. That being said, the execution could have been handled better, or explained better. I don't know what it is, but the way they explain time travel in this movie, I had a hard time following, even with the simple explanation they give, and I feel that they could have done it differently too. Just something about the way they handle it here didn't really make any sense to me. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, I wasn't really the biggest fan of the first 20 minutes, because for a movie that's 75 minutes in length, the first 20 minutes go by very slowly, in my opinion, for the reason that it's your typical Act 1, in that sense where you get introduced to your characters, which I think is fine, but you also get just nothing but endless exposition dump, which consists of a bunch of technobabble that the characters try to simplify, but I'm left with more questions than answers on certain things. The second problem that I have with this movie, the pacing to this movie is all over the place, because as I just mentioned before, the first 20 minutes go by super slow, but after those 20 minutes in which our characters begin their mission by accident, the movie goes by so fast, it's over in the blink of an eye. I mean, sure, I know the movie's 75 minutes long, but I feel like they could have added some more things to it. Now, what do I mean by this? The movie, after the 20-minute mark, is nothing but a series of fight scenes, one after the other, with no breaks in between. Now, the problem with having a string of action scenes that occur one after the other is the lack of build-up, because in some of the other installments of the Fate franchise, what really makes the fight between certain master-servant pairs work is the way they build up to the fight by planting seeds along the way. And some of those seeds could take on the form of seeing which master-servant pairs have the best chemistry with each other, figuring out the identities of some of the other servants, or when you do have certain master-servant pairs show up in one location, you don't know if they're gonna fight each other or join forces to fight against another master-servant. In short, there was ever a shifting alliance between certain pairs of master servants during these Holy Grail Wars. I mean, just look at Fate Zero, for example. In one fight, Saber and Lancer are enemies, then at some point later in the story, they become allies, depending on the situation, and then they go back to being enemies again. And there's a lot that leads up to some of these fights. With this movie, on the other hand, as I just mentioned before, when one fight ends, the next one starts. Sure, technically after the fight with Lancer, there is a bit of a lull, but it doesn't last very long as we go straight into the final fight. Another problem I have with the movie is the numerous plot holes. And dear God, there's so many plot holes, too many plot holes. The big one that stood out to me was the one revolved around this certain character who appears within that first 20 early minutes of the movie, and they establish him to be an important character. Then, you have that explosion that goes off, and you presume this character dies. But then, after our main characters defeat Saber, that same character shows up at the very end, and essentially reveals his true colors. And I just have so many questions. How did he survive the explosion? How did he get there? Why is he there? And why is he suddenly evil? To put it simply, things didn't add up. As for the next problem I have with the movie, is really more of a nitpick, and it revolves around the weird squirrel animal thing. Now keep in mind, I did not play the video game in which this movie is based on, and even then, from what I heard, apparently this movie only covers the prologue, so I'm not sure if that particular animal has an important part to play later in the video game story, but for this movie, I could have done without it, since I didn't think it added any importance to the story. And for the last problem that I have with the movie revolves around the ending, because the movie ends on a cliffhanger. And the way it presents the cliffhanger, it's basically saying, here's the next few adventures for our characters, and if you want to figure out what happens next and if they succeed in their mission, play the video game. I just find this to be super weird because, at least according to my knowledge, I don't think there was ever a anime that came after this movie, which I find to be super weird given that all the other installments of the Fate franchise have gotten a proper adaptation that tells the entire story, or with Fate Stay Night's case, telling each of those routes in the form of 2 different animes along with a movie trilogy. Yet you get this one video game which has a prologue that leads to nowhere. So, for my final verdict of Fate Grand Order, First Order, now, I'll say this much. Between this and the 2010 Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works movie, Fate Grand Order, First Order is the better Fate movie. That being said, how does it stand on its own? If you go in expecting a ton of fight scenes, then you're set. But as far as everything else is concerned, I think in order to fully appreciate the movie, you have to have some type of extensive knowledge on previous installments of the Fate franchise before watching this. Because if you go into this movie without any prior knowledge of the Fate franchise, I think most people will be very confused by certain plot points and references that would probably make more sense to someone who is familiar with the franchise as opposed to those who aren't. Although, for a movie that was made for TV, it was a lot better than expected, even though the movie itself came off more as a pilot for a TV show that we may or may not have gotten. So, overall, Fate Grand Order, First Order, it's a fun, action-packed, TV-made movie as long as you understand the terminology and references going into it. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about it? So it looks like not too many people have seen the movie. And for my final rating of Fate Grand Order, First Order, I give it a 3 out of 5. So out of all of the installments within the Fate franchise, which one is your favorite? And see you later.